Nintendo's pricing choices may often seem mysterious, and yet I think in many ways they reflect some interesting insights into their thinking. I recently watched a video from Nintendo YouTube sensation Arlo in which he explored this issue and seemed to come across more questions than answers. Why are games with such apparently different value propositions as a Famicom Detective Club Double Pack and Zelda Breath of the Wild both priced at $60? Why was a bare-bones 3DS port in the form of Luigi's Mansion 2 HD priced at $60, while the painstakingly rendered world of Talon 4 in Metroid Prime Remastered had just $40 on the sticker? There are more mysteries still in some ways. Breath of the Wild and Link's Awakening are vastly different games in scope and yet priced the same. And then there is the case of one first-party title so far to break out of the pricing paradigm with Tears of the Kingdom at $70 or regional equivalents. So let's try to get to the bottom of it all. How does Nintendo approach pricing? What are they trying to communicate, and what can we deduce about their strategy by applying both economic analysis and our knowledge of their philosophical proclivities? Hit like and subscribe for me and settle in for a Nintendo Forecast deep dive on Nintendo's pricing strategy. I will say before we get into it that I am not analysing what Nintendo should charge for its suite of games or for any individual title. That might be an interesting conversation, but it's not what I'm trying to establish. I am just purely looking to examine why Nintendo, by its own lights, makes the choices that it does with regard to pricing. So to do that, let's start by reviewing the prices that Nintendo have used in the Switch generation. I'm going to use American prices for ease of reference, but they seem to use some variants of these bands in most other countries. The vast majority of Switch games retail for $59.99. In the first year of Switch, whether it was epoch-defining Game of the Year like Breath of the Wild, a port like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, or a new and experimental title like ARMS, $60 was the price tag pretty consistently. Occasionally though, Nintendo has issued games that are $49.99. This year we had Mario vs Donkey Kong, Emmy of the Smiling Man Famicom Detective Club, and Endless Ocean Luminous. Past games in this category include the WarioWare titles, Detective Pikachu Returns, Pikmin 1+2, and Switch Sports. Then we have the fairly rare $39.99. Metroid Prime Remastered is the most infamous example of this, but Captain Toad Treasure Tracker also hit this price point, as did the digital edition of Nintendo Switch Sports, though people who wanted the leg strap needed to pony up an extra $10 for that premium leg elastic. Nintendo's bottom tier for physical releases these days appears to be $29.99. Nintendo World Championships NES Edition, Game Builder Garage, Big Brain Academy, Everybody 1-2 Switch, and the physical version of Snipper Clips are examples of such games. As for their upper tier, the tier for prices higher than $60, well, we know that the upper echelon is marked out by Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, which is currently unique in its pricing, but there is actually a more expensive title, that being Ring Fit Adventure, which comes in at a mighty $79.99, but does of course include the eponymous Ring Fit, without which the game can't really be played. There's also the Labo Toy-Con sets, which exceed $60, due, one can only assume, to the curse of that costly cardboard. There are a few exceptions when we get to digital titles such as Box Boy at $9.99, but for our purposes here, let's focus primarily on the physical game prices for the company's major retail titles. Now, in the scheme of things, there aren't really that many games that diverge from the standard pricing, and so we can assume that there are particular reasons for the divergence when they happen. So, having got the lay of the land, let's take some time to consider what are the factors that go into a pricing decision by Nintendo. First of all, and most simply, Nintendo needs to choose a price that covers its cost and allows it a substantial margin. Certainly in the Arlo video, a lot was made of the wildly varying cost-to-sale price ratio. However, for reasons we'll see, I think Nintendo pays almost no attention to the amount a game costs to make when pricing a title. Certainly though, if you look through this prism alone, the pricing choices do seem wildly varied. Metroid Prime Remastered might not have cost the same as a brand new title in the same series would, but it was still clearly a very lavish and expensively produced remaster, practically a remake. And I cast no shade on Tantalus at all, but once you take out localization staff, testers and the like, the Luigi's Mansion 2 HD team had 24 core programmers working on the spooky sequel. Metroid Prime Remastered had many times that, including calling in assists from additional studios like Atom Design, CG Bot, and most famously, Retro's Austin neighbours Iron Galaxy. Even if for some reason Tantalus were charging obscene prices to Nintendo for porting, and you can bet they weren't since Nintendo has plenty of potential porting partners, it would not make that much of a difference to the cost. And that's not to say that price is of no consideration to Nintendo. Broadly speaking, you can see that the $30 games are the ones that probably were significantly cheaper to make. Game Builder Garage cannibalized the contents of Nintendo Labo into its own game, while Nintendo World Championships was using edits of Famicom titles. But even then, do we really believe that Nintendo World Championships cost Nintendo half as much to develop as Breath of the Wild just because it's half the price? Clearly not, and if you want convincing, I have a separate deep dive video looking at the cost of producing Breath of the Wild and its sequel. The fact is though, I don't think covering costs is on Nintendo's radar much at all. Of course, they never want to incur costs while putting out a game. Reggie Fils-Aimé accounts for the great battle he had with the top brass at NCL in Japan when he wanted to make Switch Sports a pack-in game. The concept of giving a game away, as they saw it, for free, was seen to devalue the incredible work put in, and it took Satoru Iwata to personally intervene to break the deadlock. But equally, Shigeru Miyamoto has talked quite bluntly about price considerations in interviews over the years. In an interview earlier in the year, he explained that while many games just about break even, that's a fairly draining prospect for him. To quote a translation, he said, "But if there's no profit and we're just breaking even, then it's just tiring, right? I'm sure the people who worked with me would think that that's not what we worked for. So the reason why I don't praise my co-workers half-heartedly along the way is because, anyway, the reason I think it was good to work with them is because we sell a lot. I worked really hard, but I just got my money's worth. I don't make things or do things just to get my money's worth. I think everybody works hard every day to make something that sells, becomes a big hit, and makes people say, I can't stop laughing." This was the interview with Mother's Shigesato Itoi, in which Miyamoto-san identified 30 million as a big hit for them and said they hope to have one of these every 3 to 5 years. But more than that, they already have incredibly healthy margins on their products. Japanese gaming analyst Dr. Serkan Toto broke down the percentages for a game recently and concluded that once you deduct retail stores, licensing fees and manufacturing costs, publishers take home around 65% of the cover price of a physical game. But we know for a fact that publishers eat up this percentage very quickly. Take Mario plus Rabbids Sparks of Hope. At first it launched at $60. Currently it is available for $19.99 digitally. Kingdom Battle is available for even less. This gives a strong idea of how large the publisher margins are on these games, and most companies eat into them for a pastime. Now, all this was explained brilliantly on a Quora post over a decade ago by Blizzard Entertainment programmer Zach Baker, in which he confirmed that if a video game's price is dropped by a retailer after release, it's the publisher, and by extension the developer, who take a big hit in terms of the profit from the sale. I'm going to read and talk through the whole post because it really is fundamental to understanding why Nintendo can take such a different approach to their pricing. He explains that a price cut usually means that the publisher has granted what's called a markdown allowance to retailers, which eats into the publisher's margins significantly. Video games are a business where retailers are generally allowed to return unsold product to the publishers, just like the record and book industry. But publishers really don't want that to happen, so they do deals with retailers instead. That way they can avoid lots of them coming back, which then have to be sold to a liquidator that puts them in those discount game bins. Why would they allow vendors to return from retailers, you ask? Because that way they can charge higher prices. Here's the deal. If a retailer bought the game and couldn't return it, they would usually demand a pretty healthy margin. In fact, wholesale prices are often marked up by 100% to create the base retail price. That ratio is so common that it's called keystoning, and it's what you find in most traditional retail. However, for products based on intellectual property, the product sells for way beyond the cost of goods, so it's in the publisher's best interest to sell the retailer a $60 game for $52 with return privileges than for $30 but with no returns, and so that's what happens. In a returns-based system, the publisher is highly motivated to sell lots of product at near full price through pre-orders, paying retailers to drive sales through ads and in-store displays, cooperative advertising funds or display allowances, and supplying free with purchase items to juice retailer interest. So that's returns, and just understanding that should give you a lot of insight into why things in the video game industry and similar industries are the way they are. With that understood, back to markdown allowances. Clearly, a retailer paying $52 for a game is not just going to decide to reduce the retail price to $45. They'd spend a little to send it back for the full $52 instead. Both sides, knowing this, they arrange to reduce the price the retailer pays for the unsold merchandise. Of course, this is easy since no money has changed hands yet. That's a markdown allowance, which effectively reduces the retailer's cost. When this is done across the board, it's called a price protection allowance. But all that money essentially comes out of the publisher's pockets. Now, for a successful release, these allowances come slowly and steadily and can actually help the game make even more profit. Then eventually the game can be relaunched in a greatest hits line, the difference being that manufacturers have a lower royalty rate on greatest hits games. But if markdown allowances are granted soon after launch, it's a sign that things have indeed gone wrong, which is really bad news for the developer, who only do well when the publisher shows a healthy profit. So actually no, when the price of a video game drops soon after its release, significantly less money is going to the publisher. So if you feel a need to show your love for a developer or publisher, buy their game on the date of release. Okay, now all this might sound grim for many publishers, but in Nintendo's case, we all know that Switch games simply don't significantly drop in price. Sure, hang out on Deku deals long enough and you can pick up some sweet bargains, but nothing in the same solar system as the way other publishers' titles plunge in price. What this means is that whereas for other big publishers, they will be getting progressively poorer margins over time, in Nintendo's case they have the same or nearly the same margins on games, more or less in perpetuity. One of the reasons games go out of stock relatively quickly, I suspect, is that Nintendo does not overproduce titles, and so because the games are relatively scarce, they don't need to worry about returns so much. Plus, they know that their games are high quality and can trust that they will sell in time. Even Metroid Prime Remastered at $40 is going to have a much healthier margin than Mario plus Rabbids Sparks of Hope did for all but its first month or so on the market, because while Metroid Prime's price remains fixed, Sparks of Hope went diving ears first into the bargain bucket. The fact that Nintendo has managed to make even the idea of these deep discounts laughable accounts to a large degree for why they don't need to consider the cost of developing games when they're setting a price, and they can focus on other measurements of value. Clearly, I'm not saying there's no link ever between the cost to produce and the cost at sale, but even in a case like Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo might argue, not very convincingly perhaps, but they may argue, that it's to do with cartridge size costs and not to do with the fact that they could recoup the costs of a very long development time from one of their top teams. Overall though, they do not expect every game to sell at equal amounts, and their whole business model is very consciously to have a few absolutely gargantuan sellers to help bankroll the rest. Don't get me wrong, they're not going to throw good money after bad, which is one of the reasons why I fear they may not want to pursue another Advance Wars in the near future after that game's rocky launch. But whether they charge $1 or $100, Mario vs Donkey Kong is unlikely to ever light up the skies like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Changing the price will nudge some more people to buy a game they're interested in, but ultimately the games themselves have intrinsically different appeals, and Mario Kart 8 is always likely to be the bigger seller. Remember also that Nintendo's development efforts are pooled. Even games developed by external studios or Nintendo subsidiaries around the world go through the nerve center of the Entertainment Planning and Development Group at Nintendo, who almost all work out of the same Kyoto building, though one team is based in Tokyo. If the Mario Kart team was funded by Mario Kart and the Pikmin team was funded by Pikmin, then development resources would soon be warped in a strange way, in a way that ultimately just chases existing success and freezes out both competition and the chance for smaller franchises to grow and realise their potential. Sure, we would have the biggest budget Mario Kart you can possibly imagine, but the cost of it would be that you would have a very low-cost Pikmin title. The prices of the games reflect the cost of the whole development team at Nintendo. Let's go back to that Miyamoto interview as a case in point. Miyamoto-san said, "As we make various preparations, there are times when something catches our attention and we think, or this might be something that will turn out well. We can sense such things from the very beginning. However, if we are only thinking about greed or wanting to stabilize our profits, we will overlook this." Itoi-san chimed in, "Yes, if you're only motivated by greed, you will think first about how to avoid losing money. You will inevitably think in terms of the break-even point." Miyamoto responded, "That's right. I think the most dangerous thing is to miss something that has the potential to grow. I think the good thing about our company is that we've been good at nurturing those seeds." Okay though, we're still at an impasse on their pricing choices because of the cost of development isn't primarily driven by the development costs of any individual game. What accounts for some of these big differences? There are some other reasons why prices are chosen. For one, it can be a way to communicate value. Now this can work both ways as well. Meet Gerard Ratner, whose 1991 gaffe has gone down in the history books as a terrible cautionary tale. He described his company's product in, shall we just say, in the interests of family-friendly forecasting, scatological terms. Yes, funnily enough, describing your products as rectal ejector turns out not to be a hugely savvy business move. Go figure. Overnight, Ratner wiped £500 million from the value of his company. But it wasn't just knocking the quality of the product. There are plenty of things that people buy that they know are low quality, but they buy anyway. But when he colourfully explained that his store's earrings were cheaper than a prawn sandwich but probably wouldn't last as long, he undermined the central lie around pricing, that of value. Because pricing is really a strange thing in lots of ways. It's not as simple as saying that the lower the price is the better. If you were offered a car for £1 or $1, you might not instantly snap it up, but instead alarm bells might ring. The apparent value and the price are disconnected, so there must be a reason. Could that £1 spend actually incur more hidden costs later on? In some cases though, pricing too low can be positively detrimental, including in many luxury goods. And I think Nintendo has an almost superstitious anti-Ratner position on this, which is that they value their content very highly and say so. I don't just mean that each individual game is valued as worth its weight in gold, but that Nintendo products are intrinsically seen as of high value, almost irrespective of customer opinion. Let's rewind to Reggie's memoirs in his brilliant book, Disrupting the Game, in which he recounts that moment when Reggie and Mike Fukuda found themselves at the end of Shigeru Miyamoto's ire for even suggesting that Switch Sports should be a pack-in title. As Reggie says, the ever-present smile and impish squint of Mr. Miyamoto's eyes were gone. Then he quotes Miyamoto-san directly, "Neither of you understands the challenges of creating software that people love to play. This is something we constantly push ourselves to do. We do not give away our software. Every product is precious and valuable for no other reason than because it is a Nintendo product. Take Nintendo World Championships. There seems to be on the core credits a couple of dozen core game designers, plus technical support, debugging, testing and localization to bulk out the credit numbers. However, clearly this was not a big team, and the game probably took them about 2.5 years from conception to finalization, judging by the fact that the team seemed to carry over from the late 2021 title Big Brain Academy, Brain vs. Brain. If you were to price this title in a manner commensurate with its intrinsic value, that is to say the value of the man-hours that were put in, it would probably cost about 1/50th of a game like Breath of the Wild, which had hundreds of core staff and was in the works for over 5 years. But from Nintendo's point of view, why should they try to over-account for the level of effort they did or didn't put into a game in a way that would encourage radical price swings from game to game? All the games Nintendo put out reflect all the effort and expertise that Nintendo's team have cultivated over the years, and all the games absorb the cost of game development that we don't see, the prototypes that never go anywhere, the experiments that don't amount to anything, the versions of games that need restarting. Unusually, very unusually, the early announcement of Metroid Prime 4 allowed us a glimpse into this happening in real time, when Nintendo were forced to announce that the project had been restarted, but there are strong rumours that this has happened in recent times too, to projects such as Pikmin 4, which Miyamoto in 2016 claimed would be coming soon, but which didn't turn up for another 7 years. Realistically, you have to imagine that there are many such prototypes for a company as experimental as Nintendo. Not everything can hit it out of the park first time. Occasionally, as with this ARMS featurette from the Nintendo website, Nintendo gives us a peek behind the curtain. But when you're talking about the value of a game, you have to account for the intrinsic and undefinable quality of just being a Nintendo product. If Nintendo did a Ratner and said, actually this game was dead cheap to make and is only really worth $5, it would do incredible damage to them in terms of undermining the perception of their whole product line. Therefore, they need to be incredibly guarded about going low on pricing, even for games like Pikmin 1 Plus 2, which seem to be really as bare bones as can be, mildly up-resed GameCube ports. And that's because Nintendo's products aren't covering the cost of a single game, but the entire development effort at Nintendo, including the abandoned Pikmin 4 versions and other oddities that may never see the light of day. Of course, Nintendo might quite like to imagine a world in which it flew the other way, a world where you could say, okay, brain versus brain maybe isn't worth even the lower $30 price point based on the time and effort it took to make, but Breath of the Wild is worth 5 times as much, so let's have a game priced to reflect its value. $150 for a Breath of the Wild game, s'il vous plaît. I mean, the idea sounds intrinsically preposterous, and in a sense it is, but only because our concepts of price and what seems reasonable and what doesn't have been carefully managed over time. We know games can be sold for much cheaper. Check out the way most third-party and non-Nintendo prices collapse on themselves like a dying star, sometimes mere days after release. Most companies will cut merrily into their margins to shift extra units, but Nintendo does not do that, and I would argue in many respects it can't do that, at least not while keeping that Nintendo mystique. When you buy a Nintendo title, you are implicitly buying into their view of craftsmanship, of quality, and that does come with a premium. It is clearly a premium that is very much in their favour. They're a business after all, but I think by their lights there is a moralistic purpose. Miyamoto's argument to Reggie wasn't about capitalistic advantage, but about the challenge of creating a game. The value of each game Nintendo puts out is that it is, they would contend, the best they can manage at any one time. Of course, that's not to say that Nintendo haven't had their fair share of shameless corner cuts, but if they ever once admitted that, then they would jeopardise themselves. Former Nintendo insiders turned superstar podcasters Kit and Krista have confirmed that Nintendo pay very close attention indeed to review scores, and that makes sense. You can afford the occasional Mario Strikers Battle League shoved out the door with a frankly disappointing array of content, but they need this to be the exception and not the rule in terms of how people view Nintendo. Once you start cutting prices, even for a flimsy offering, it sets an expectation that they will be cut in the future. I'm reminded again of how Ubisoft sold masses of copies of Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle and then were surprised when the full price Sparks of Hope didn't shift. All of this describes something called positioning. Nintendo has positioned itself as a premium brand and they need to price accordingly. Their upper limit is marked out for them, of course. $70 is currently the highest standard price on the market, and I don't think Nintendo will want, in an ideal world, to be the first person to stick their heads out of the trench for fear of getting shot at. They don't want people to feel their prices are unreasonable, and they can, to some degree, get away with a slightly lower retail price, partly because their games are technologically less cutting edge than your average AAA PlayStation or Xbox game, but also because they don't drop their prices into the toilet within a couple of weeks, meaning they can actually maintain their margins for the longer term. And yet, I would argue that the price of Zelda Breath of the Wild was not, in fact, $60. Yes, that's what the recommended retail price was, and that's the price people mostly associate with it. But I would contend that for a very substantial number of people, the price of Breath of the Wild was $360. That is to say, it's the kind of game that Nintendo fans will buy a Nintendo Switch just to play, and therefore it does make its higher development costs back in a roundabout way. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was of course just a port of a Wii U title, but it did take a lot of development time on the Wii U. So if its effective cost there was also $350, the cost of the Wii U plus the cost of the game, then its Switch sales are effectively making this difference up. It's not just systems though. Nintendo sell bespoke accessories relatively often. Does that bit of plastic that makes the Joy-Con into a wheel really cost to make anywhere near the $13 that they're charging for it? I highly doubt it, but it's a nice extra that can be sold off the back of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Super Mario Party Jamboree has the Joy-Con charger to sell, Switch Sports had the leg strap, and any number of games have had special edition Joy-Con or other accessories in tow. All of these mean that just comparing the face value price is a misleading way to reflect the amount of revenue Nintendo feel they can gain from a title. Alright, what we've covered so far explains why Nintendo's ceiling is, broadly speaking, $70 and why their floor is, broadly speaking, $30. It also explains, I think, why their decision to price individual games bears very little relation to the perceived value proposition of any individual title, and less still to the cost it took to develop each title. But if my arguments so far were taken to their logical conclusion, Nintendo would not bother with a pricing strategy at all. They would just shove every game out of the door at $60, come what may. Clearly they don't, and so we need to look at some other key considerations. And here I'd like to bring up an economic concept I've mentioned briefly in another video, but will explain more fully here, which I think goes some way to explaining Nintendo's pricing rationale for different titles. And if you excuse me, I'm going to drop in a chart, a standard one in economics, which is the demand curve. Basically, this graph shows that the lower the price of something, the higher the demand will be, and the reverse is also true. If I'm selling a drink for $1, I'm going to get a lot more takers than if I'm selling it for $10. On the other hand, it's a curve, because past a certain point, it probably doesn't make much difference. If I sell that drink for $100 or $1,000, I'm still very highly unlikely to get many takers, and similarly, if I drop the price from 2 cents to 1 cent, it's very unlikely anyone is going to turn around and say, wow, that was just too pricey for me before, but now that it's 1 cent, I'm going all in. Basically, it's decisions in the middle of the curve that the price differences are crucial. In Nintendo's case, if they price a title at $80, $90 or $100, they are likely to seriously dent consumer demand, if only because it might trigger a backlash because they're breaking so far from the established norm. On the other hand, selling a title for $10 or $20 may get them more sales than if they sold a game at $30 or $40, but they're making far less on each title, so it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory. However, there is one feature of demand curves, which is that they can be steep or they can be shallow. In fact, to better illustrate the case, let's look at a vertical demand curve and a horizontal one. Let's say instead of selling water, I'm now selling air, and you're in a capsule orbiting the Earth and are nearly out of air. At this point, whether I say I'm charging $1 or $1,000, you're going to basically pay as much as you can and ask for credit to the rest, because quite simply you cannot afford not to have the air. Nothing I do with regard to price makes a blind bit of difference to the amount of demand there is going to be for this precious air. This would be an example of something being priced inelastic. On the other hand, imagine a completely flat curve. Here, the tiniest move on price will completely undermine demand. An example here would be if there's someone else in the capsule and they're selling air for $1. Now, if I then charge 99 cents, I would probably get all the sales because I am at least cheaper than the competition, and for the same product. If I charge $1, I will presumably get half the sales, and if I charge $1.01, I will get probably nothing. Tiny change, but an absolutely huge impact. This will be an example of something that is incredibly price elastic. Now, the price elasticity of a product's demand is a very important factor for businesses deciding what to scroll on the sticker, but we can also use this knowledge to work backward to identify which products from Nintendo are price inelastic and which are not? Which products can they hold the line on price-wise, and which ones do they need to drop the price to remain competitive? So let's look at the case of Luigi's Mansion 2 HD. I completely agree with the argument that it's a bare-bones title of a fun but rather flawed entry in an otherwise great series. However, who is going to be buying Luigi's Mansion? First of all, hardcore fans who skipped out on the 3DS version, plus probably a handful who played the 3DS one anyway. Well, dedicated fans are unlikely to be affected too much by price because they really want the product. Then there's parents buying for children on the strength of the previous Luigi's Mansion game. Now, casting no aspersions, but I would suggest that in the main these people, non-expert in Nintendo's lineup, are unlikely to be enormously discerning. If their little ones like Luigi and a new Luigi game eventuates, are they really likely to bombard the Amazon chat robot with messages querying the frame rate, texture upgrades, or whether it truly represents value? No, they're just going to buy the thing. On the other hand, they might reasonably assume that a lot of people already own the 3DS game and are fairly unlikely to double dip. In this case, whether a game is $60 or $50 or even $30 is really quite unlikely to make a significant difference to whether or not people pick it up. I'm not saying there would be some people, perhaps even people in the comments of this video, who would be charmed into a purchase by a price drop. I'm just saying there wouldn't be nearly enough of them to make that price drop make fiscal sense if you're optimizing, ultimately, for profit. And of course you might argue that it's wrong or unethical not to drop the price a bit, but as I established earlier in the video, Nintendo's view of ethics are somewhat different. Luigi's Mansion 2 HD is $60 because most people playing it are going to feel that it represents $60 of value, or at least at the point of purchase. That case can't be made, perhaps, with Mario vs Donkey Kong, where the gameplay style itself is less flashy and high-end, so in that case, they did put it out at $50. What they don't want, though, is people going home and feeling like they've wasted money on a Nintendo product that is too expensive. So a $50 price tag communicates to the customer that yes, this is slightly cheaper and therefore a slightly more limited product than most others on the market, but the price point is still relatively high because, well, it's Mario. It's not just that people will pay it, but that if any character at Nintendo needs to be defended as a store of value, it's Mario, and so I think it will be a very long time before we see a substantial price drop for any significant first-party Mario title. The only exception would be if the game itself is very much smaller in scale, such as, for example, if they ported Dr. Mario World. I think we can see this therefore with all the titles that are in the $50 range. $50 communicates that yes, frankly, there is just less content, and we won't want you to be disappointed, but we still want to maintain the value perception of the product, and therefore it's only just under full price. So, which games are price elastic, i.e. they do respond to big swings in price? Well, I would argue that all the ones that are $29.99. Nintendo World Championships NES Edition, Game Builder Garage, Big Brain Academy, Everybody 1-2 Switch. These are classic examples of whim purchases aimed at the casual audience. Nobody was marking off the calendar in anticipation of the glorious release of Everybody 1-2 Switch, except perhaps to laugh at it, and anybody who was on board Snipper Clips because Snipper Clips was just a cool game had probably already bought the game digitally. So these titles are being marketed to people who are ambivalent about buying a game, but could be persuaded with a low price. Now, Nintendo's prices are never going to be as low as many of their competitors, but knowing how strongly Miyamoto feels about pricing, $30 is a fairly big concession to the demands of the market. But this still leaves us with one category that is mysterious, the $40 tier, and in particular, Switch Sports and Metroid Prime 4. I think what's curious about Switch Sports is that despite the fact that the Wii Sports series sold absolutely gangbusters on the Wii and Wii U, they evidently had lost confidence in it to a large degree, as otherwise they simply would have rushed it to market in the early days of the Switch. The fact that they didn't reflects, I think, the fact that they wanted to focus on core experiences to start with and only gradually pull outwards towards casual fare. Of course, Ring Fit Adventure had done very well for them, but would Switch Sports simply feel a bit dated? Let's also not skirt around the fact that this clearly was not a game that had been lavished with vast amounts of time. It was a cheap and cheerful bare-bones set of motion control minigames that they sold with a $10 piece of elastic, which probably cost them the tiniest fraction of that to actually manufacture. I think this was a deliberate effort to probe the breadth of that market. And from the sales Switch Sports has garnered, it is a very wide base indeed. Now, for casual games like Switch Sports, the price is highly elastic, but even so, I suspect that in future, Nintendo will probably try to give future entries in this series, and I'm sure there will be such entries, a higher price point. Of course, the other advantage of Switch Sports is that it is likely to bring in casual gamers, and so if it does encourage people to either upgrade to a system with a stand or that can dock to be played on the big screen, or just to make sure they buy a system in the first place, it would probably be worth a lot more than the $40 sticker price. But the biggest mystery of all remains Metroid Prime Remastered. How could Nintendo, a company that holds up the value of its games as sacrosanct, charge less for this than for Emu the Smiling Man? Actually, Emu is absolutely awesome as well, but let's not get sidetracked. In this case, I think there are a few considerations at play. First of all, it is clearly the case that for a significant hub of Metroid players, the games are incredibly price inelastic. If you drop Metroid Prime 4 tomorrow but it was $200, I reckon there would be a very substantial number of Metroid fans who would go, I literally don't care, I didn't plan on eating this month anyway, it's Metroid and I must have it. And I should note that this is the tactic they took with Metroid Dread. They didn't soft shoe on price because Dread was, air quotes, just a 2D side-scroller. No, they doubled down and said, this is worth full price, and more than that, it's worth buying a Switch OLED model console to play because you need to experience these blacks as they were meant to be experienced. With Dread, they were leveraging that Heartland fanbase so that instead of paying $60, the effective price tag of that game was $410, the OLED model and the game. And of course, I realise the system won't just be for the one game, but for a great many people, and certainly many of the day one customers, Metroid Dread was, and in many respects remains, one of the major showcase titles for the benefits of the OLED screen, specifically its capacity to make those deep blacks really pop. But Metroid Prime Remastered has no hardware to push. It's not entirely clear what the game sold because we only have figures from the first few weeks where it cost 1 million, but let's say for argument's sake that it sold the absolute basic, met expectations level Shigeru Miyamoto has quoted before of 2 million copies. I'd hope it shifted a few more, but who knows. Now, let's assume that these are almost all hardcore frenzied Ridley worshipping Metroid heads. In such a market, if Nintendo were to sell this title at $60 as opposed to $40, much of this would go straight onto their margin, so Nintendo would stand to have made the $20 difference times 2 million, so an extra $40 million. That could buy you quite a few decent nights out in the big city, but in Nintendo's recent, relatively weak quarter, they had a net profit of $500 million, so $40 million is not that big a dent. Now, they didn't really, truth be told, leave so much of that dedicated fan cash on the table, because if you recall the release schedule, it dropped digitally, and then the physical version followed. I am absolutely sure that there are a decent number of people, including some YouTubers I've watched, who went for the digital edition because they were desperate to play it, but followed up with the physical copy for posterity. The effective price of Metroid Prime Remastered for those people was therefore not $40 at all, but $80, a much healthier price tag to reflect growing appetites from Nintendo's point of view. But why drop down to $40 at all in the first place? So if you're Nintendo and you have a game that is beloved by the core audience, but also incredibly well regarded and nigh on legendary, how do you push that out? Well, you need to be competitive with other third-party experiences on the system. I know Prime and Doom are obviously vastly different types of games, but they share certain common traits. What Nintendo are effectively trying to do with the price of Metroid Prime, therefore, is to interpolate themselves into the territory, broadly, of these sorts of games, the Dooms, the Skyrims. This would suggest that they thought there was a point at which the price would drop enough that suddenly a new audience made up of the people who play these other types of franchises would come in and check the series out. It might also be just a reflection of the markets they're aiming at. Metroid is very much a Western phenomenon. Even though its concepts were birthed in deepest Japan, fundamentally I think Nintendo realised that this is not something that's likely to be of massive interest in their homeland. So perhaps they wanted to get some attention in Japan, but perhaps also they thought that foreign markets would be more responsive to a case based on high quality with a lower price. I think their hope may have been that they could take a short-term hit on sales in order to lure in more people who would not necessarily have considered a Metroid Prime game before. Now, if that was the case, and it's pretty speculative, but to me it does seem likely, was that effort a failure? After all, there is scant evidence that Prime blew the doors off in terms of sales numbers, despite being a real bombshell announcement at the time. But I think there's another play here. Even if Prime Remastered wasn't picked up by a large number of people, if people are playing it and sharing it and recommending it, it creates a long-term word-of-mouth campaign for Metroid Prime. It raises the profile of the franchise. Advertising campaigns are tricky things, and while sometimes advertising brand new games is important, you also don't want to be pouring money into a distended campaign for a game that many people don't actually want. So this represents, in a way, a piece of advertising. Metroid Prime Remastered was a way to get Metroid Prime in front of hundreds of thousands of eyeballs which had previously remained untroubled by Samus's visor. I think there is a fundamental confidence there in that product. What they're effectively saying is, if you try the game, you will like the game, and so their mission with this price is effectively trying to recruit people in that highly elastic market that is normally reserved for these kinds of equivalent PlayStation and Xbox titles. Moreover, while the initial price is competitive, as we've seen, they still can expect a very healthy margin because that price will be a lot stickier than your average title on a rival system. So, what have we learnt? First of all, we know that Nintendo has effectively parked any consideration of the innate cost of development for any individual title. Their games reflect the cost of the collected expertise and efforts of the massive developers that work for them. Even where a game is frankly of pretty low effort compared to others, they can never admit that, or even particularly communicate it through their pricing, as they have to look at the value a consumer will find in it and how elastic or inelastic that pricing is. In fact, Nintendo also knows that much of their demand is not enormously sensitive to price changes, but where it is, they can act using the healthy margins they always maintain to offer a more competitive price on specific occasions. They also need to consider their software not just discreetly, but as part of a landscape of software and hardware with leg straps, fitness rings, pokeballs, wheel accessories, charging stations and other accessories sold off the back of the games, to say nothing of the consoles themselves. Now perhaps you might say this is unethical, that it's one thing to pay full price for the new Zelda, but charging that much for Luigi's Mansion 2 HD is just crossing a line. But Nintendo get hard numbers, clear and unambiguous data of exactly how much people will spend, and ultimately the health of the company comes from being able to manage these many factors. Right or wrong, that's how they've built themselves to the position they're now in. However, what does Nintendo do with all the cash they end up sitting on once they sell these games? To find out, you will want to watch this video on screen. Please also feel free to like, share, comment, subscribe, check out the Patreon, which has a lot of cool extras, and meanwhile, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.